All right, everyone, welcome back. Okay, this is going to be chapter 2 from the book, From Territories to Independent States. And this is basically going to cover the post-World War One period up to about the 1940s, the end of World War Two. Okay, excuse me. I'm going to skip through section 2.1. We'll just jump into 2.2, state formation in the 1920s. So, for the most part, Britain and France come out the big winners in World War One. And Russia looked like they were going to come out a big winner, but as we talked about, Tsar Nicholas II was assassinated. The Bolshevik Revolution rises under Lenin and Trotsky, and they're kind of left out, not only because the communists are turning internal and trying to fix their own sort of social problems, but also the West doesn't really want to include the communist government in their former agreements, right? And so you get a lot of big historical events that lead to what, at least on a map, what looks like the Middle East today, right? So you get what's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, um, and the Hussein-McMahon agreements. The Hussein-McMahon agreements were sort of a discussion between Ali Hussein in Mecca, maybe Medina. We'll get to it in a second. But basically, was the leader of the Arab Revolution against the Ottoman Empire, right? Because the Ottoman Empire was part of the Central Axis with Germany, the Ottomans, etc., against the Allied axis of Britain, France, a tiny bit the U.S. at the end, and Russia. And so the Hussein McMahon Agreement basically said, okay, the British government and the Allies will back Arab governance and Arab states in the Middle East and North Africa after World War One is ended, and when the Ottoman Empire is broken out post World War One, right? And then you get the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which basically says we're going to try to set up a Jewish homeland in what was then Palestine, right? And then later you get the Balfour Agreement, which is basically sort of an institutionalized Sykes agreement, right? And Pico Sykes also said, look, this is how we're going to break things down between the Russians, the French, and the British. And we'll talk about how all that broke down too. And, and so we really get what the boundaries and territorial boundaries of the area look like just coming out of World War One. We're talking 1917 to about 1922 ish. Okay, there were a bunch of different goals on the ground, right? The Arabs wanted to overthrow the Ottoman Empire, to have Arab control of their own territory, right? To get sort of Western colonialism and neo colonialism and mandates and all of this kind of stuff out so that they could have sort of self rule, right? Um, the British were very strategic. They wanted a supply route to India, so not only over land, which largely looked like through Iran, but also overseas, so through the Suez Canal and then Palestine, because it's strategically important as sort of a port area, right? Um, so this meant that they needed to retain control of the Suez Canal, which was right in Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea. This is an incredibly powerful piece in the strategic spot on Earth, right? Um, it takes about a month to go through the Suez to India. It takes like 5 months to go around the Horn of Africa, right? So that's money and time. It's also incredibly strategically important militarily because of where it is in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea and these sorts of things. And so, yeah, the Suez Canal was vital to the British. Let's see. The Brits and Europe really needed access to oil. They knew there was oil in Iran, No one had yet really discovered the extent of oil on the Arabian Peninsula yet, and so Iran was very strategically important, and they did a lot to control that, which we'll talk about in this first unit. And then finally, the British wanted stability in the way the Ottoman Empire collapsed, right? I think everybody saw it coming. And so to avoid the chaos or the anarchy or whatever it might be, the civil wars, who knows, when the Ottoman Empire collapses, they wanted some semblance of stability and control over what happened afterward. And that led to their agreements with other allied powers and with Hussein in modern day Saudi Arabia. Okay, the goals of the French were largely territorial. So they wanted to be able to control the North African spot sort of right across the Mediterranean Sea from them. They wanted to push their imperial power, which was waning and had never been all that strong if we're talking about colonialism and colonial powers from, say, the 17th through the 19th centuries. And then they also wanted some sort of cultural coin, right? They wanted to push French culture, language, art, this kind of stuff. All right, you've got a bunch of sort of local state builders at the time. You got Kemal Ataturk, who we'll talk about in Turkey. You've got Reza Khan, who later becomes Reza Pahlavi in Iran. You've got the Arab revolt, sort of led by Sharif Hussein ibn Ali of Mecca. Um, and then later you'll also have the Saud family, who we'll talk about. All right. Do-do-do-do. Yeah, I've already talked about that. Okay, post World War One, who the way that it really sort of pans out is that the French get Syria and Lebanon. If we're just talking about the sort of Middle East area, the French end up with Syria and Lebanon. The British end up with Palestine, Iraq, and Egypt because of the Suez Canal, like we talked about. And Iran ends up mostly under the control of the British, and then there will be growing Russian and US influence in that area as the communists sort of start to get their shit together in Russia, and want to lean on their neighbor a little bit. And as the United States starts to really lean into industrialization, at least during the Woodrow Wilson administration, and then moving into World War II. Okay, section 2.3, the turbulent 1930s and 40s. All right, so first we're going to talk about Ataturk and Turkey. Then we will break down Reza 1. Okay, later I'm going to present a lecture where it's Reza 1 and Reza 2, right? Because Reza 1 led until the 1940s, and then his kid, Reza 2, who is also Reza Pahlavi, ended up ruling basically until the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And so I'm going to say Reza 1 and Reza 2 a lot, right? But I'm going to kind of give my own overview tomorrow on some of this stuff. All right. So, yeah, okay. Ataturk in Turkey, Reza 1 in Iran, and then we'll discuss Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia. Okay, Ataturk. We're seeing the collapsing of the Ottoman Empire, right? And we had just seen sort of the rise of the Young Turks and the constitutional reform movement from 1905 to 1911 ish, where they're trying to push reform, constitutional legitimacy, republicanism bordering on democracy, secularism, all this kind of stuff, right? Okay, so the Ottomans collapse, and you really get the rise of Kemal Ataturk, who was a military leader who takes over after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And he's got four main goals. He wants to create Turkism, Turkish nationality, Turkish nationalism, right? Turkish identity, whatever you want to call it. Second, he's trying to deconstruct and rebuild Turkey's political institutions and move away from monarchism and sort of influence from Islam, right? Third, he is trying to institute mass institutional and social change. Mostly, I just said institutional, mass social change, right? And a lot of the control over the institutions also led to social change, including the schooling systems, language, thoughts on national heritage. There's a lot of propaganda and stuff being pushed out, all this kind of stuff. And then finally, Ataturk was pushing for economic development, quote unquote modernization, and industrialization, especially moving away from just an extraction economy to an industrial manufacturing economy, right? All right. So we'll sort of review all of these four goals or these four major changes he brought on the Turkish society. The first is trying to make Ottomans under the former empire now see themselves as Turkish, right? And there's a lot of propaganda and media sort of promoting Turkish language, Turkish culture, Turkish history, all of this sort of stuff. Even what is it called, like folklore and this kind of stuff. Creating new Turkish heroes and lots of it. There's high levels of nationalism, and this generally means high levels of xenophobia, right? Othering some other culture to empower your own or to show how yours is an improvement upon alternatives, right? And so this led to high levels of repression, not only of the Kurds, but also the Armenians. They were either sort of forced into exile, and there are estimates that like 1.5 million were killed. And from what I remember, Turkey still to this day doesn't really accept the term genocide or ethnic cleansing. So it's still kind of a hot topic in international relations, even to this day. There's also high levels of repression, trying to tamp down on other, quote unquote ethnicities, religions, um, these sorts of things, political critiques, etc. There's internal resettlement programs to try to urbanize some of the population. We were touching on the rural nature of some of these regions, and so there were massive programs put into place to force people into certain locations. And to this day, there are still really high tensions with the Armenians, who we mentioned, the Kurds, who we've mentioned, and who generally live on the border with Iraq, with the Kurds from the Iraqi state. Um, and then the Greeks, because there are a lot of Greeks in Turkey and vice versa, and then there's sort of the Cypriot problem and etc. Okay, number two, they Ataturk wanted to change Turkish institutions away from the monarchy and the caliphate, right? And so he disbands the caliphate basically in 1922. He leaves one caliph until 1924, when he's finally solidified enough power to just sort of get rid of the entire endeavor. Ataturk introduces a secular Western approach, sort of the Euro model, right? I should mention that a lot of these Euro states, I mean, sort of non Euro or quasi Euro states like Turkey, really want to be, or at least a chunk of their population sees themselves as part of Europe and aspires to be a sort of European democracy, right? Um, and this Ataturkian direction was, in a sense, trying to accomplish that. It just took a really brutal and dictatorial approach, which is, arguably antithetic to most of European modern history, right? Okay. So he bans the caliphate in 1924, sets up secular westernized institutions, tries to grow the military and the bureaucratic apparatus, especially as we'll learn, to sort of gain more and more control over uh, the rural regions where there's less direct control by the state. And Ataturk's platform politically was based on populism, nationalism, which includes, high respect and a mass expansion of the military, which has historically led to a lot of coups in this state. Some real touching on sort of ethnic purity and cultural purity. Ataturk was a despot and came from military, and so this sort of matches his vision, right? There's also a lot of statism mixed in here, right? And especially sort of corporatism, statism, if we want to put it on the spectrum somewhere. There's a touch of republicanism trying to spread expertise to lower local regions and townships and stuff like that. But it's still like Ataturk's the top, right? Uh, Again, secularism, they're really trying to move away from religion, Sharia law, Islam in general. Ataturk and later Pahlavi often see it as undermining their project, right? And then finally, reformism, right? A lot of his platform is based on we need mass change. And a lot of this sounds pretty familiar to a lot of other areas in the region, right? And even Reza One, his approach is sort of Ataturk light. All right. Number three, mass social change. Again, they want to, a lot of big chunks of these societies that are bordering on Europe and sort of the post communist states even see themselves as part of the European project. But there's a little bit of the turning up of the nose by the Europeans to some of these states as well. So it's a mixed bag here. But that means bringing in sort of merit based bureaucracy, secularism, all of these sorts of things. A separation of church and state, which obviously is touchy in pretty much any society. Um, they wanted to see economic advancement, and so this meant major training programs, but it also meant some pretty seedy deals with outside influences who could provide technology and stuff. And then freedom of expression. This is a mixed bag too under Ataturk, where if it was, expression for Ataturk, it's great, but criticism was sometimes even criminalized, right? Okay, weirdly enough, Sharia law is replaced in 1924 with the Swiss Civil Code, which I find rather interesting and kind of want to go dig in and learn more about that. Um, Another way of secularizing the society, in a sense, and even controlling I don't know, the ethnicity, personality, traditionalism, whatever you might have. Some clothing is even outlawed under Ataturk. The fez is outlawed, like I think that's the little round cap with the little tassel, and men are literally forced by law to wear like those European bowlers, right? They also introduce a new Latin-based alphabet and sort of language in 1928 and get rid of sort of the former I don't even know the Turkish script, I guess, which I think comes from Syriac. All right, finally, economic development and industrialization. This is the fourth piece that Ataturk really changed moving forward. You get high levels of state development of private industry, right? And so this looks like a lot like ISI from Latin America, where you get the state pumping in money to try to develop, um, national industries and manufacturing and things like that. And while they're pumping money into sort of building these nascent industries, they're also putting up high trade barriers to external competition. But there are problems with this, right? And it's not exactly like that because in the long run, they were looking to jump back into the international scene and compete, which is not really like Brazilian ISI, but in the short to medium term, it looked a lot similar. And this leads to a lot of what we know looking back corruption and graft, and it removes the incentives for companies to, I don't know, pump investment back into their own company in human capital, which means training and software development for, and teaching um, your employees how to use new software and technology and all these sorts of things, but also research and development into new products and improvements and all this kind of stuff. So this didn't work all that well, right? And it ends up being really corporatist and leads to very high levels of corruption and graft and inequality. And the state today is run by Recep Tayyip Erdogan. We will get to him later in the semester, but I'm going to kind of leave it there at the end of Ataturk. All right, section 2.3.2, Reza Pahlavi, Reza 1 in Iran. Okay, the Shah of Iran was very weak at the end of World War One. The military had just been trounced basically by Russia and Britain. And oftentimes the military would just like lay down their arms or wouldn't even show up to a battle or would just like retreat immediately. Things were not going well, right? And the UK or Britain especially and Russia had a very easy time sort of taking over territory and resources very late in the 19 teens, but also in the early 1920s, right? And so Reza I, who is another military leader, was one of the few who actually was successful during this time, just like Ataturk in Turkey, and basically has this sort of self coup. It's a coup. He makes himself prime minister, but leaves the king in charge, the Shah, for a few years, right? And eventually he dismantles the monarchy in 1925, gets rid of the current Shah, and becomes um, Shah Reza Pahlavi, right? But he's sort of unlike Ataturk, who, I don't know, maybe it was propaganda, maybe it was real, and he just never could get it implemented. I don't know. But in many ways, Ataturk supported democratic principles and republicanism and these sorts of things. Reza never really went that far. Reza was kind of into being king. Uh, and there are arguments that, you know, it was more difficult for Reza because the power of the Shiite branch of Islam and the clerics were far more powerful in Iran than they were in Turkey. But still, I also just don't think that Reza was ever all that interested in becoming a truly democratic Iran. Okay, so the differences from Turkey and Ataturk's scene are that Iran is a lot more ethnic division and sort of warlordism or pseudo feudalism or tribalism. I'm not sure really what you call the scene at the time. But it's Iran has far less control over the, outside of the major urban centers than did Turkey, right? Iran is kind of the Wild West in many senses, right? And they can keep the urban centers relatively safe and productive and these sorts of things, but they really didn't have the military power, the infrastructure, the state apparatus, any of those things to be able to sort of control outside of the capitals, right? And so, yeah, you have a lot more sort of tribal or ethnic or whatever you want to call it division. You have far less economic development in Iran than Turkey was at even at that point. There's more control by external forces in Iran, right? Because of all the oil, because of their incredibly strategic position, sort of between the West and Russia and the Strait of Hormuz and all of these sorts of things. Um, and then, yeah, Iran had a more powerful clergy than Turkey did. Reza was more focused on actually building just, I don't know, territorial integrity, territorial control than was Ataturk. Ataturk took a much bigger role in all of everything, right? Um, to, infrastructure, military, thought, power, industry, clothing, all these sorts of things. He took a much more sort of direct hand. But Reza one was much more focused on just sort of making himself established, taking control of the entire territory, hopefully eventually getting sort of Western influence out. Though that did not happen, and he became entangled in it eventually. He sort of made agreements with tribal leaders around the area and often either bought them out or would play them against each other, right? And sometimes, if that didn't work, he would just dominate them with the military power that he had. Again, like Turkey, there were forced resettlement programs. They were trying to sort of exert control over the rural regions, but also, they hoped to build some major, manufacturing areas or get some agricultural efficiency, all of these sorts of things. He really focused on communications and infrastructure, right? So built out a whole bunch of roads, made it very easy for the military to travel around the country, and then improved their communications equipment dramatically, right? To be able to, again, sort of exert influence over the far reaches of the Iranian state, which is pretty huge. You saw a mass expansion of their military and you saw a conscription. So their military went from like 40,000 to 130,000 or so. Reza and then later his son Reza II were pretty involved in buying up military technology and equipment from places like Germany and the United States and sometimes the British. And there were often agreements or cooperation between oil extraction and military importation, right? And we're seeing sort of the same thing with Saudi Arabia today. Let's see, Reza also becomes a military dictator and becomes extraordinarily wealthy, as does his son, which we'll talk about later. But in Ataturk society and under Reza Pahlavi or Reza I, we start to see some real extreme inequality, right? Because not only are they growing pretty rapidly, these economies in many senses, as they attempt to quote unquote modernize, uh, but you're also seeing a very unfair distribution of the wealth that does hit the scene at the time. Some major cultural changes that Reza I institutes, just like Ataturk, he bans Sharia law. This happens in 1926. You get more bans on traditional clothing and the veil for women, more institutional secularization. Right, they're trying to sort of if not outright get rid of the Shia clerics, then sort of minimize their role. Hopefully, we can get rid of them in the future. I think that was sort of the intent. Um, let's see. Okay, in 1941, as World War II is sort of hitting its peak, the British and the Russians invade really easily yet again, and Reza I is exiled. And then for some reason, they put in Reza II, his son, as the leader, and he's sort of a puppet for a while, but then garners greater and greater control. We'll talk about that as well in this unit, but that'll be a later lecture. All right, finally, Saudi Arabia, 2.3.3, Ibn Saud's Arabia. So here again, the Ottoman Empire is falling apart, but there's a difference between Turkey here, who was sort of the center of the Ottoman Empire in many ways, and Saudi Arabia, or modern day Saudi Arabia, what used to just be called sort of Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula, in that the Ottomans didn't have a lot of full control over the Arabian Peninsula for a bunch of reasons, right? We had not really discovered the extent of oil, so there really wasn't a whole lot of like economic influence in Saudi Arabia at the time. Um, the geography just makes it remarkably difficult to deal with the logistics and control aspects, especially with communications technology just finally starting to get off the ground in many of those areas with like the telegraph, right? And so there was a lot more influence internally and a lot more competition internally in Arabia than there was from the Ottomans, right? And so you see this guy, Abdul Aziz ibn Abd al Rahman, rise from the local Saud clan. And in Saudi Arabia, there is a sort of strand of Sunni Islam called Wahhabism. And it, I guess the distinction, there's a couple distinctions, but one is that they're less focused on just Allah as uh, the deity, I guess. And they see, I guess, deist tendencies in some of the greatest leaders of Islam historically. And so this is, I guess, the major sort of schism in the Wahhabist strand. But they have been and are very tightly wound up with the Saud royal family. And at the time, not only do you have uh, Ali Hussein from Mecca being supported by the British against the Ottomans, but they're also sort of propping this guy Abdul Aziz up to sort of just carry out raids against the Ottomans and competition and these sorts of things, right? Just to sort of seed some chaos on the ground for the Ottomans. Eventually, Abdulaziz unifies most of the territories, takes over all of the major cities, declares himself king in 1932. Things are going okay at first, and then they start to really spiral downward. The spending isn't going well. The royal family is pretty profligate. But then they discover oil, and the Saudi Aramco, under a whole bunch of different former names, it eventually becomes Aramco, Saudi Aramco, whatever. And American influence really starts to dig in. This lays the foundation for what we call a rentier economy, or what leads to what we call the resource curse. We'll talk about that later too. The idea, basically, in its most succinct form, is that if you have resources like diamonds, gold, petroleum, etc., there's no need for you or for your government in general to impress the citizens because you don't need taxes to function. You get to skim off the top of these. And so your government tends to have very few rights, tends to be very repressive. tends to not really care about citizen input, all of these sorts of things, right? Okay, but we'll talk about that later. U.S. corporate influence is growing in the region in Saudi Arabia. There start to pop up little small towns of U.S. oil workers. The U.S. government and the State Department start to issue internal documents saying that, like, this is troubling. Saudi Aramco or Aramco has more influence than the United States government does in Saudi Arabia or with the Saudi royal family, right? And we also start to get some troubling reports of mistreatment of not only local workers, but also foreign workers from around the region. So think some of the very poorest countries in the Middle East, but also some of the, Malaysia or the Philippines, or some of them will move there. And there are concerns about labor rights. They also have really high traditions because of this raunchy economy of monarchy, really high levels of nepotism. But they're trying to really wash up their image, right, under Mohammed bin Salman or MBS. And they are seeing sort of rising influence in technology. They just bought up a huge video game company. In culture, in sports, right now they have their own like golf tournament. So yeah, MBS is a very troubling character, and we'll talk about him too. But all right, I'm going to end it there. The neighbors are out. Have a great day.